I know we're covering how sort of wealth dynamics is sort of influence our own business, but I'm also going to cover a bit of why now is the time to start podcasting. So my name is Woon Tan. I run this company called Podcast Publishing, which is a podcasting agency. I started my business just over a year ago, but I've been in sort of Rogers community for a long time. So I've done my wealth dynamics just over 6 years ago. And in fact, it was because of doing this wealth dynamics test that I realized I had to move away from where I was. And so when I was, so this is the first podcast interview I did 6 years ago. Back when 6 years ago, I was actually working in an insurance company. So I was working in insurance for 10 years. I was actually studying to be a qualified actuary, and it's a steel environment, and I was setting premiums for household and motor insurance, working in risk management, doing financial modeling, but I'm actually a star profile. So completely different profile, completely wrong environment. And because I did the profile and saw how star profiles could grow their career, I realized I really wanted to do interviews and use interviews to build my business, build my authority in the space. And that's what I did. So I set out to interview founders of environmental tech company. So I realized there's all these big waves coming. Going to Rogers conferences, we all know about the waves. And so I knew nothing about environmental change and sort of, climate change and all these changes that are happening to our environment. And I knew there was a lot of innovation happening, but I knew no one and knew nothing about it. And so I set up my podcast called Clean Web Conversations. I went to a meetup group in London and sort of proposed to interview them and put the podcast out. And I was, to my surprise, everyone was so friendly and willing to be interviewed. And that was really my first taste of running a podcast and doing interviews. And so what happened was I took a while to get myself started running the podcast, but through that process, I was able to leave my insurance career. And since then, I have been a community manager. I was working for London's largest sustainability tech co-working space. I was running events for them. And during that time, I had a lot of friends who wanted to launch their own podcast, and I knew how to handle every step of the process. And so that's when I realized I got a business here, and I sort of decided I'm going to set up podcast publishing as a business. So that's how I got started. So just a show of hands, how many of you here listen to podcasts, and like, why do you listen to podcasts? If you can unmute yourself and you want to share, please feel free to do so. I'm curious.
I listen and I produce a podcast. So I'm on both sides of the fence. And actually, it's just a great medium to listen to in the car, when out walking. And there's so much diversity out there now. It's absolutely fabulous.
Yeah.
I think it's as good as a good book. You've got something, generally podcasts, when they're well done, they're little snippets. They're like little oasis where you get sort of a little snippet. Well, it could be long enough, but I just like them. I just think it's a nice medium. I like the listening. Sometimes video, if it's not video isn't necessary, then it's a distraction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I think with video, there's a lot of sort of visual content that might not actually add as much value, and I think that's where podcasting really stands out, because you really go straight into the storytelling and the emotions and a lot of the things that you can't really convey when there's all these other distractions. So so we are entering a golden age of podcasting, and in terms of numbers, like a third of the US population are listening to podcasts weekly, and 1 out of 8 people in the UK are listening to podcasts weekly. And this number is increasing, and it's been consistently increasing for the last 10 years, and it's sort of projected to grow even quicker. sort of like 10%, 15%, 20%, that sort of number of growth rate. And one of the things that is really exciting with podcasting is what's Google doing to podcasts. So we all know that Google with YouTube completely changed how videos worked in the last 10 years. And so Google's vision is the same, when they're going to be completely changing how podcasts is going to be appearing in search results. So they just started indexing podcasts about 2 years ago, meaning that podcasts would appear in search results just like text, images, and videos. And, you know, we were just talking about AR and VR, and with audio content and podcasts, it's going to happen. There's going to be a revolutionary sort of user interface moment as well. Now we are seeing smart speakers entering our homes, and the sort of interface is through the mobile device is going to completely disappear, and you can sort of just pull out and sort of ask for your podcast, ask for your favorite podcast, and Google would sort of play it for you. And this is the same for Amazon Alexa, and so there's a whole range of innovation happening in the podcasting space. Spotify, another big company in the podcasting space, they have they did a report just a year ago, and they say that 81% of people have taken action as a result of listening to a podcast ad. And so by taking action, they mean that people have been interacting with brands on social media. People are listening, people are researching products, and also people are creating word of mouth effect, sharing about brands, and purely because of podcast ads. And so Spotify is a very big player. They've invested heavily in the podcasting space, and they've been in this acquisition spree, acquiring a number of podcasting agencies, podcasting platforms, and really combining and trying to dominate the market. But really, at this stage, there's quite a lot of different platforms and big tech players out there, and so there's no sort of YouTube for podcasts, or there's no Netflix for podcasts at this stage. So there are really a lot of different platforms out there. This could be surprising to some people, that there are only 1 million podcasts on Apple Podcasts as of March 2020. So if you think about it, this podcasting has been around for the last 10 years, but in terms of number of podcasts, there's just only 1 million podcasts. So in terms of where it's heading, where the growth opportunities is really massive. And so for every podcast out there, there are 70 YouTube channels and 700 active blog posts. So there's really a lot less competition compared to the other forms of channels. And also, this is one of those things that is not so surprising when you think about it, but basically average watch time on Facebook is 60 to 90 seconds. Average watch time on YouTube is 4 minutes, whereas on podcasts are on average 20 minutes long, and up to 80% of listeners tune in to entire episodes. So in terms of engagement, the level of engagement is increasing. Not just the number of listeners are increasing, the engagement levels are increasing as well. And it's really because podcast offers passionate, highly targeted, on-demand content. So that's really the power of podcasting. And then a quote from Seth Godin, legendary internet marketer. He's been blogging in the late 90s when not everyone's online yet, and this is what he's got to say: podcasting is the new blogging. And then I've got, I think, 2 more slides. So a lot of us as business business owners, business leaders, we are sort of growing podcasts because of the ability to network and influence. Interviewing other peers and experts in your niche will make you a leading learner. So if you create a podcast, you're really allowed to interview anyone on your show, and it's a really powerful tool, and you'll be known as an expert in your space. And so it's a very, very powerful way to get to know other people in your space, and really build your niche. And so this is one of my clients, impact leaders. He was in investment banking, but he was not really in the whole impact investment space. But what he was very keen was to learn about who are the biggest impact investors. And so he created Impact Leaders, and then within a short space of time, he was networking and creating his own fund because of this podcast. And then I think a lot of people come to me because they ask me, how do you make money? So it's obviously podcasting is a form of content. It's, like a content marketing approach. The more followers you have, the more prospects you can get, and so the more money you can make. So it's a highly engaging medium, so you convert very highly. And then the number one podcast out there, the Joe Rogan Experience, he made $30 million in 2019. So there's definitely a lot of money to be made. And there's also new forms of business models out there. So Patreon is one of the membership subscription platforms. And one of my friends, Rise to Meet You, he's a Malaysian as well. I'm from Malaysia. He's based in London, but he's got he and his co-host, they are comedians in London, and they created this podcast in 6 months ago, and they're now making £1,000 per month through Patreon, just through their content. So yeah, that's kind of me. I've got some free resources on my website, or if you want to email me, I've got a podcast launch checklist, and I'm also doing a webinar on Friday if you are interested in creating your podcast and you want to do you want some ideas around it, how to create your perfect podcast idea. Let me know. I'm running it Friday morning 8 a.m. This coming Friday. So any other questions? I know it's been quite a fast paced presentation.
Thank you.
I have one for you, Woon. I like podcasting. I think it's a great medium. I'm not so sure it's actually that good for learning anything. And the reason I say that is because, as we heard in Eva's presentation, people have different learning styles. And if I'm a visual learner, then having an audio medium isn't actually going to work for me. And I just wonder if you have a comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect question. In fact, actually, podcasting is far more visual than you imagine, because for the best storytellers out there, you got to be very visual in your language, and so it's really left to the audience's imagination as to what you want to describe. And so podcasting is really forcing people to be better storytellers, and hence better visual storytellers as well. And then the other point is that I've got a lot of clients who are creating webinars, and they're turning their webinars into podcasts. And the reason is because people don't have time to sit on a computer in front of another Zoom call. And so it's a very powerful way to repurpose your content. So that's the other thing from a visual point of view. And the other thing I would say is, we know from Wealth Dynamics that creators or people in the sort of dynamo space are a lot more visual learners. But from my experience, a lot of the dynamo people are listening to podcasts because they're free from another form of visual stimuli. And so it gives them the ability to learn through their own imagination. And so that's why I've got quite a few friends who are dyslexic, and they listen, they can't read, and so they are listening to podcasts, audiobooks. And so that's why I think there's still a very important aspect for audio and podcasts in terms of as a learning medium. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, could I address that as well?
Yeah.
We're actually doing ours on Zoom. Mm-hmm. So we have actually got the visuals available for those that want it. I mean, we haven't actually decided where we're going to upload them to yet. I'm not sure to do YouTube or what, but we do actually have visuals for pretty much all our recordings, all our chats. So for those that want to have that medium, we've done it that we can actually do both.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key things that that's actually happened since the lockdown is that people are forced to do virtual interviews. And so when I first started, very pretty much 100% of people were doing face-to-face interviews. And now with the lockdown, everyone's moving onto Zoom calls, and I think with Zoom calls, it's just so much easier to get an interview and book an interview with someone else. But also, I think there is a bit of a challenge in that Zoom is a video conferencing software, and so it's not really built for podcast first or audio first. So there's some level of audio quality that you're losing out, but it's minor compared to not doing it. So I would say that there's always room for improvement. And actually, what's funny is the best podcasting software out there are now only starting to get the impetus to build on heavily because people are demanding to have studio level audio quality, but doing it virtually. And there's quite a lot of innovation happening, and there's things like spatial audio. There's like audio that one of the challenges is obviously with Zoom, you're sort of bounded by internet bandwidth, and so people are using Zoom because there's that sort of face-to-face connection, but then the audio quality in terms of the software, how it's being built, it's not built for audio, and so there's some sort of compression and loss in quality in the audio. But we're seeing new companies that are really doing well because they were they're sort of serving the podcasting market, and I guess it's something to be aware of.
Yeah, we found a couple of tricks. I mean, number one is to record each person separately.
Yep.
So that when we edit, we can take out noise. We've also found, I mean, I use an external mic. We have found that we also need to have earplugs in, or a headset of some description. It makes a huge difference, and we actually couldn't believe what a huge difference it makes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the thing, like it's something that actually will make a difference.
I think the issue as well with podcasts is they've kind of come from the broadcasting background, the broadcasting world. So generally podcasts, they were used a lot by, say, radio stations or whatever. So, the quality of them is better. And this is where, if you are going to do a podcast, we can make, if the video isn't a great quality, you can kind of go, oh, well, and kind of guess what it's like. But when audio is bad, it really is a nightmare. So unless you have a good quality audio, it really takes away from the integrity of it, but also how reliable is something if it isn't good quality? You believe something if it's done correctly, whereas if it's done a bit not very, if it's a bit cackly or whatever, you think, oh, well, this person hasn't, got, the story isn't as reliable. But I think that's what I was trying to say in terms of, the microphones and the whole technology that we'd be used to using on a daily basis. For when you're doing something online and you're recording online, as you say, Woon, the quality is really important, and that's where people sometimes need help to do it.
Okay. Eileen, you wanted to add something. I know we've gone over time, and but it's so interesting that I thought we'd just keep going. If anybody needs to leave, then thank you for joining us. But this is really interesting. So, Eileen?
Yeah, no, I think it's really, great that this medium is now coming up. I think it's fairly obvious when you say the attention span on Facebook is like 4 minutes, whatever it is, 90 seconds or something. And then when people are actually listening, how long they actually stay listening without the distractions of having to look at any video or having to interact with any. So I think it is very powerful that people do actually get to hear what it is that you're saying. So I think I just wonder what, make sure you send the link to your 8 a.m. on Friday. I'll be there.
I'll share.
And us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Yes, Kerry.
I quite like podcasts because you can just stick your earbuds in and go out for a walk or something. But what puzzles me is how do you actually monetize those? You said about putting them, do you sort of stream it to something? Sorry, there's a cat just appeared on the table. Yeah, it's just about getting that. How do you monetize? It's a thing.
Yeah, so there's a number of ways you monetize your podcast, but the most obvious is currently people are using podcasts to grow their following. So people are using podcasts to build their community and using podcasts to build their brand. So that is the most popular, most common approach why people are making podcasts. But it's a long game, so it doesn't instantly give you money. But there's a number of different things you can do to if you want to create a podcast that makes you money instantly. And so you can use your podcast as a prospecting tool. So imagine if you're a guest of a podcast, you're using it as a way to really do a sort of almost like a sales conversation, but the sales conversation is being recorded. And so you create a podcast where you're actually prospecting at the same time as you're speaking to your guests. And so that's one of the things that people have been doing in the last like 2 or 3 years, that we are discovering that it's so much more powerful just to interview your potential customers, especially customers that's slightly out of reach, that's not your sort of lower level products customer avatar. So that's one way you can make money out of doing podcasts. And then the other thing that is very, very effective is really checking out places that are, well, in terms of, like how you would monetize a YouTube video or your YouTube channel. There are platforms out there that allows you to monetize your content. So Spotify has this platform called Anchor, and you can immediately monetize your content there, meaning that other brands' ads would appear in front of your content. And so you get a share of whatever ads that ad revenue that's being generated. And so that's that's another channel. And then, like I said in my slide earlier, you can create membership content. So these are more exclusive content that people pay to access you, or check out behind the scenes of your podcast or your business. And so there's a very huge appetite for more intimate content that you can provide. And so this is a very heavy content approach. If you've sort of you enjoy creating that content and you want to serve that audience, then audiences can pay you directly, and that's through membership sort of business model.
Okay. And the other one, so is there like an optimum length of a podcast?
I don't think so. I think as long as your podcast is delivering value and that people are listening to it, then that would be my advice. So there are very short podcasts that are sort of less than 10 minutes long, and then there are sort of your regular interview based podcasts, and they could be from half an hour to an hour long, and as long as it's interesting enough for the guests or for the listeners, then it's appropriate.
Okay, thank you, Kerry. Steve, you've got your hand up.
Kerry just asked the question I was going to ask, which was the optimum duration. But I did have a second question. What holds the most interest in a podcast with the content? Is it a storytelling, or is it so it's a single person telling the story, which, as you alluded to earlier, if it's told properly, you generate the visuals in the person's mind, or is it two people having an interview or a conversation? What will hold interest more strongly?
There's no I don't think there's a comparison at this stage. Like the diversity of content is really growing very quickly, and so there's a whole range of formats of storytelling that is appearing. So in the first phase of podcast growth, a lot of comedians realized they could just create a podcast and build a brand. And so a lot of the online content initially were just comedians cracking jokes, because that's what they do. And then they could quite easily build an audience without without fluffing about with the video sort of a visual format. But there's definitely also a huge amount of money being poured into highly produced podcasts that are produced by people with a lot of journalistic experience, a lot of editing that goes on behind it, a lot of research and curation. And so those types of podcasts are being created as sort of almost blockbuster star podcasts. And there's even podcasts that has been turned from podcasts into movies. And so Hollywood is now like looking into podcasts as a whole source of news stories that they could turn into films and movies and TV shows. So I think in terms of the format, this is one of the interesting things, right? So and this is the only thing I can share with you in this type of group. So creators love to tell stories, and I think creators have their own perspective and very strong interesting ideas, and they love doing the monologue approach. Stars obviously love to do interviews, and they're really good at promoting the guests. And then I think supporters, I find I've got quite a few supporter clients, and the supporters podcast can go on forever. That's one thing I realized. they can have an interview that goes on for hours and hours, and I need to chop them off. I have to tell them that's enough. But that's kind of an interesting observation that I found.
Thank you. Anybody else got any questions for Woon? Because we're quite a bit over time now. I think the next meeting, which is in a month's time, third Tuesday in the month, we'll have less talks, but we'll give people a little bit longer to talk, because each one has been so interesting that I think we'd like to know more. So if anybody would like to volunteer, just drop me an email. I'll put my email in the chat. And apart from that, are there any other specific questions that anybody has? Kerry?
It was a software question, actually. You mentioned there are several softwares out there to put together podcasts, but what's the best one to use, or the easiest one to use, should I say?
Woon?
Sorry, yeah. So in terms of hosting platforms, I would say something like Buzzsprout or Anchor. I would say Audio Boom. I would avoid Anchor if it's a business podcast. And there are different criteria that you might be thinking of, but Buzzsprout and Audio Boom is the one that I would recommend.